In 1918, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky were united as left communists in opposition to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and the next year, in 1919, they collaborated and created the ABCs of Communism, which educated aspiring communist militants around the world for years to come. When the Bolshevik Preobrazhensky was initiated in 1918, it was welcomed by both, and in 1920, Bukharin would provide a theoretical justification and eulogization for the practice in his book, The Economics of the Transition Period. But when Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921, Bukharin, who had by that point left the left, became the foremost advocate and theorist of this policy, while on the other hand, Preobrazhensky was hostile to its implementation. The two economists, once united in anti-peasant, ultra-revolutionary attitudes, now stood on opposite ends on the industrialization debate and clashed constantly on what was to be the proper policy which the communist dictatorship should take in regards to the peasantry, industrialization, and the construction of socialism in the USSR. When the Bolsheviks transitioned from revolutionary party to ruling party, they also were forced to transition from dreamers into active builders. Rather than just speaking of modernization, they were now the ones forced to create that new society with their own hands. Thus, Bolshevik ideology itself was forced to undergo a transformation because the standard Bolshevik orthodoxy did not provide the necessary tools for this new evolutionary modernist role thrust upon the Bolshevik Party. According to Cohen, the Bolshevik Party was, quote, bifurcated by two conflicting ideological and emotional traditions. The party, it seemed, was split into two: the Romantics versus the Pragmatists, the left versus the right, Yevgenii Alexeyevich Preobrazhensky versus Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin. Between 1921 and 1923, Bukharin began to rethink his positions. According to Cohen, he published noticeably less during this period. The one-time leader of the left communists had, upon the introduction of the new economic policy, come to moderate his views. By 1923, he had come around to a new vision, a new understanding of the Bolsheviks' role in the revolutionary process. Cohen quotes Bukharin saying, "In the fire of this self-criticism, the illusions of the childhood period are consumed and disappear without a trace. Real relations appear in all their sober nakedness, and proletarian policy acquires in appearance sometimes a less emotional, but therefore a more assured character, a solid one, adhering closely to reality, and therefore much more truly changing this reality." From this point of view, the transition to the new economic policies represented the collapse of our illusions. For Bukharin, the illusion was war communism, but what was corporeal, what existed and made itself real, was the new economic policy. According to Bukharin, the introduction of the NEP outdated the party program introduced just 2 years earlier in 1919, as well as his and Preobrazhensky's own ABC of communism, which had become a Bolshevik Bible and a world revolutionary hand guide. In Bukharin's revised thinking, he began to create his theory of equilibrium and the construction of socialism via the NEP. Cohen states that Bukharin's new concepts was the idea that civil peace should replace civil conflict, but this did not mean the cessation of the class struggle. Instead, it meant that the class war would take up a form of an economic struggle, a peaceful competition that took place on the market. From this, he would formulate the concept of the evolutionary path to socialism, the idea that the process of establishing socialism would be a prolonged period of development of the USSR's industrial and economic institutions. He began to present Russia as a two-class society, with the proletariat in the driver's seat and the peasantry in the shotgun. The relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry featured heavily in Bukharin's new understanding of Marxism in the 1920s. In 1925, he spoke of the peasant as the, quote, great liberating force of our time. He began to view the world itself as a global city encapsulated by a global countryside, where the majority of the world's population resided, the masses of the peasants being a majority and the proletariat being a minority. The Smichka would not just be a Russian phenomenon, but a worldwide one. A global Smichka between the Soviet state and all the peasants of the world needed to be created and sustained. Domestically, he also began to move away from the standard peasant stratification into various high, middle, and low segments that had been characteristic of Bolshevik thinking for so long. Now instead, he spoke of the peasantry as a wider mass whose economic alliance would ensure the victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat and subsequently socialism. Bukharin's theory culminated thus in an increasing justification of the concept of socialism in one country, which he helped promote with Stalin in 1924 and 1925. But while Bukharin accepted, adopted, and defended the provisions of the NEP from day one, Preobrazhensky stood against it initially. Preobrazhensky, like Bukharin, was greatly in favor of war communist policies. In 1920, he wrote a pamphlet titled Paper Money in the Age of Proletarian Dictatorship, where he upheld the death of the Russian currency as a prelude to the future abolition of money in communist society. Even when Preobrazhensky came around to accepting the necessity of the NEP, he was still skeptical of it. He feared that within the provisions of the NEP was a potential back door for a petty bourgeois counter-revolution. Immediately after its introduction, Preobrazhensky would write a book titled From NEP to Socialism, which is written in the form of, quote, a series of lectures purportedly given in 1970, which described the course of development of the Soviet economy in the decade after the book's publication. Within the fifth lecture, the prediction Preobrazhensky has for how Russia would develop is laid out, where in the past, the economic situation of Europe was one based upon an economic link between socialist Russia and capitalist Europe. In Preobrazhensky's vision of the future, or rather, his description of the past from the future, Soviet industry was able to quickly subordinate agriculture to itself. He determines that nationalized farming and state industries will expand greatly as a result of the tax in kind, and the state industries would play a greater part in the role of developing the national economy. He imagined that, over the course of some years, with the recovery of industrial enterprises to their pre-war outputs, various industries such as aircraft, chemical production, and machine production will grow to such an extent that they will produce for the domestic market, and they would export their products, leading also to greater economic ties with the countryside and a subsequent fall in industrial prices. Although in Preobrazhensky's vision, the NEP was to be limited, and year by year, as the situation improved, socialist enterprises would eventually overcome capitalist relations in the countryside. He still imagined the NEP to last longer than it actually did. In his text, he speaks of the first decade of the NEP, during the course of which money was increasingly phased out of production, as state planning and distribution took over. But all of this represented a vision. During the actual course of development, he and Bukharin began to draw up plans based on the existing experience of the NEP. Agriculture, as we know, assumed a primary role in the early Soviet economy. It was to be the linchpin of Soviet industrialization. On this aspect, the party leadership took up the position that industrial prices should be reduced so that demand for manufactured goods would increase amongst the peasantry. In 1923, and more so, 1924, the first challenge to the prevailing theory and economic practices of the party leadership came following the Scissors Crisis. Here, Preobrazhensky and the left challenged the, quote, ideology of the Restoration period, coming out against the party line and with a strongly worded letter to the Central Committee in October 1923. But even before then, Preobrazhensky was at the forefront of the left minority opposition to the party's policies. To paraphrase Cohen, in the Appeal of the 46, the Bolshevik left accused the party leadership of not having a long-term industrial plan. Then, they demanded an energetic and planned development of industry that operated independently of the rural market. They accused the party leadership of pro-peasantism and representing a Kulak deviation. They attacked Bukharin's ideas, which would in time represent Bolshevik orthodoxy as, quote, middle peasant Bolshevism. For Preobrazhensky, the entire fate of socialism in the USSR hinged on its rapid industrialization. The question then was how to achieve this. In Preobrazhensky's vision, the way to achieve this was through a large investment in the industrial sector that would enable both expansion and technical reconstruction of the Soviet industrial base. Where is this investment to come from? The peasant economy. To quote Cohen, he called for a, quote, massive preliminary transference of surplus value from the peasant sector to the state industrial sector. While the right-wing party leadership favored giving increasing concessions to the peasant so that he might produce more, the plan advocated by Preobrazhensky advocated for increasing pressure on well-to-do peasants, the kulaks, that is. This acquisition of resources from the countryside, the preliminary transfer of surplus value, Preobrazhensky thus termed primitive socialist accumulation, a term which he borrowed from Vladimir Smirnov. But for Preobrazhensky, he used this term in an analogous manner to the primary accumulation that occurred during the formation of capitalism. During the process of the creation of the original capitalist system, the resources needed for the accumulation of capital were acquired in a particularly violent and hostile manner. This was something that Marx termed primitive accumulation. The capitalist system presupposes the complete separation of the laborers from all property and the means by which they can realize their labor. As soon as capitalist production is once on its own legs, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces it on a continually extending scale. The process, therefore, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possessions of his means of production, a process that transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producers into wage laborers. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it. The economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. This was the analogy Preobrazhensky was making when describing how the USSR would accumulate its resources for industrialization. However, in Preobrazhensky's mind, that sort of violent expropriation of resources that occurred under the capitalist variant of primitive accumulation was both unnecessary and, quote, on principle, not an option. The socialist economy needed to devour the capitalist one, but it would do so, apparently, without repeating the compulsory violence that occurred under capitalist primary accumulation. The law of primitive socialist accumulation for Preobrazhensky was instead, actually, to quote Alexander Elrich, a, quote, dramatic illustration for his idea that the law of value had to be suppressed as far as possible. The concept of the law of value featured prominently in Preobrazhensky's understanding of the world economy and the Soviet economy's position within that economy. For Marx, the law of value was that unseen but evident rule which governed the general function of capitalist economy. Every commodity's value was determined by socially necessary labor time. The exchange value of these commodities, represented in money capital, was then regulated by the law of value, as those prices fluctuated. This general law applied just as much to the world economy as it did to the practices of that individual capitalist whenever he made his investment decisions. Preobrazhensky believed that in the new phase of capitalism, monopoly capitalism that is, that the law of value no longer operated on the world stage. Because of trustification and cartelization, each segment of the world economy operated in closed worlds, economic fiefdoms if you would. Preobrazhensky believed, however, that all of the world's value relations had come to be dominated by American capital, and that the United States represented a hegemonic entity which the whole world economy revolved around. The only way to escape this hegemony, then, was to fall back into a form of socialist protectionism, which meant maintaining the trade monopoly and barring the influx of foreign goods. Through this protective shield, socialist state-owned enterprises would not have to worry about competition, would not have to operate on the law of value, but instead, beyond it, the goods produced by those enterprises would be sold above their value as a measure to accrue surplus peacefully but forcefully. But as you can probably tell, I've contradicted myself here. That is because Preobrazhensky failed to see the contradiction in his own views, but it defined his view of the path to socialism regardless, that of the isolated economic unit free from the vacillations of the market. Preobrazhensky was accused by his adversaries of treating the peasantry as a sort of internal colony from which the imperialist socialist industry would extract resources, much like the colonial nations did in their overseas possessions. But Preobrazhensky envisioned a peaceful economic struggle over blatant robbery. His vision called for the artificial inflation of the prices of industrial products and the depression in the prices of agricultural goods so that the peasantry would be compelled to invest in the development of industry. With this formula of non-equivalent exchange, Preobrazhensky basically endorsed the price scissors as a method for accumulation. The left as a whole called for a dictatorship of industry. When faced with these attacks from the left, it was Bukharin, the only economist in the party's top leadership, who was forced to defend the party's economic policy. He argued that Preobrazhensky's program was politically and economically dangerous because it would inevitably alienate the peasantry. As Cohen writes, any policy that risked a conflict with the peasantry, no matter how compelling its economic reasoning, was unacceptable to Bukharin. He was certain that the party would be the loser in such a confrontation. The indispensability of the peasantry's support, the inviolability of the Schmitzke, he now saw as the cardinal lesson of Russia's revolutionary history. The revolution of 1905 was a failure because there was not a Schmitzke between the urban movement and the agrarian peasant movement. That was the supreme lesson for us all, underlining the whole importance of the union of workers and peasants. Bukharin denounced Preobrazhensky's method, the law of primitive socialist accumulation, as a monstrous analogy, a frightful dream, and a Genghis Khan plan, to which Preobrazhensky charged Bukharin with an outburst of moral indignation. The party managed to undermine Preobrazhensky's ideas by associating them with Trotsky, who had spewed similar rhetoric on industrialization and had himself become a member of the left opposition after the appeal of the 46. But the kernel of that autarkic system that came to define Soviet industrialization was always present in Preobrazhensky's writings. he was not as keen as Trotsky to tie the fate of socialism in the USSR to world revolution. Within both Preobrazhensky and Bukharin's writings, despite the former's lip service to the necessity of the proletarian revolution in the West, existed the justification for socialism in one country. Both Bukharin and Preobrazhensky agreed that Soviet industrialization would primarily occur on the basis of internal resources, but where they disagreed was on practice and tempo. According to Bukharin, the difference between the party leadership and the opposition was that the opposition stood for an excessive transfer of resources, while the party leadership, quote, calculate much more soberly. The proletarian state was to develop as fast as the peasant allowed him to. The communists were to, as Bukharin put it, quote, ride into socialism on a peasant nag, slow but stable. Bukharin developed a concept of socialist industrialization that was distinct from the historic capitalist examples. According to Bukharin, capitalist industrialization was based on, quote, parasitism of the city in relation to the countryside, the parasitism of a metropolis in relation to colonies, the hypertrophic, bloated development of industry, serving the ruling classes, along with the extreme comparative backwardness of agricultural economics, especially peasant agricultural economics. In contrast, socialist industrialization was based on the rule of the proletariat. It was an industrialization carried out by the proletariat, for the proletariat. For Bukharin, socialist industrialization was not parasitic in relation to the countryside, but transformative and uplifting. Therefore, the new task of the Soviet state was not to exploit the peasantry, the countryside, for its own benefit, but to develop the rural regions economically and culturally. Industry, thus, was to turn its face to the countryside. Another aspect of Bukharin's vision of industrialization was the necessity of the consumer market in consumer goods. He believed that production was directly tied to consumption. The Tsarist state collapsed because of the lapse in consumer goods. If the Soviet state were to allow a price scissors, it would suffer a similar fate. Accumulation for socialist industry, therefore, could not outpace peasant demand. They could not move in a manner that antagonized their primary market. According to Bukharin, the economy existed for the consumer, not the consumer for the economy. This view on consumer goods also tied back to his critique of the foreign trade monopoly, which Preobrazhensky wished to maintain. Bukharin argued that a flow of cheap foreign goods will boost peasant productivity and thereby also stimulate the domestic economy, which sold goods that complemented those foreign products. Bukharin would then describe the rural and urban economies as a single economic conglomerate, and one which determined the tempo for industrialization. Cohen summarizes Bukharin's ideas as such. The reciprocity of the two sectors was expressed for Bukharin in mutual demand and supply. Rural demand was twofold. The peasant desired, first of all, consumer goods and simple agricultural implements. But as accumulation in the peasant economy progressed, he would also require complex producer goods such as tractors. Peasant demand, therefore, served to stimulate all branches of industry, light and heavy. The left viewed planning as a way to promote immediate and extensive investment in heavy industry. Bukharin's program envisaged a different pattern of industrial growth, looking to mass consumption as the spur, and to the capacity of the internal market to determine proportions within industry, made necessary the adaptation of industry to the peasant market. It meant beginning with the development of industries producing for personal consumption, textiles, for example, and allowing heavy industry to grow as a result of the chain process. This was how Bukharin justified the economic concessions given to the peasants and the netmen in 1925, when he famously proclaimed, quote, we must say to the whole peasantry, to all its strata, enrich yourselves, accumulate, develop your economy. A slogan which would eventually bite him in the ass later down the line. But from Bukharin's economic point of view, the removal of barriers and the increased development of trade was the fastest measure to economic growth, and thus the best means at increasing the tempo of industrialization. He argued that with the current restrictions, the peasant was afraid to accumulate under fear of being labeled a kulak. If the peasant economy was to develop, and consequently also the rate of growth in the industrial sector was to increase, then those measures which restricted the growth of the peasant needed to be discarded. From Bukharin's understanding, accumulation by the peasantry, the enriching of the peasantry as a whole, would lead to the eventual destruction of the kulaks. Elrich describes his views as such. The growth of cooperation would raise the economic level of the peasantry as a whole, and thus sap the foundations of the kulaks' power. True, the kulaks could also avail themselves of this superior technique of organization, either by setting up cooperatives of their own, or by infiltrating those created by others. But the gains secured by poor and medium peasants, who had been previously to a varying extent dependent on the village rich, would be much greater, particularly since they would have on their side the all-out support of the state. The sharply progressive taxation would narrow the income differential still further. Moreover, part of the disposable income of the kulaks would be saved and drawn into the nexus of the socialized sector of the economy and contribute to its expansion through the channels of a nationalized credit system. The end result of this gradual leveling and increasing dependence on state-controlled commanding heights would be a euthanasia of the kulak after he had very much against his will rendered a yeoman's service to the socialist economy. A classical piece of Hegelian List der Vernunft. Although Bukharin spoke of taking the snail's pace to socialism, this was not based off a doctrinal vision. He didn't explicitly desire slow industrialization. In fact, he even argued that his own program would lead to the fastest pace of industrialization, not the left's. What Bukharin had actually advocated for was for the state to not go beyond its means, that it did not try to outpace the peasant. The tempo of accumulation could not be independent from the productive forces of agriculture. If the situation improved to such an extent that the state could move faster with its program, then it must do so. But if the current situation called for a slow pace, then it must oblige. In Bukharin's eyes, he was a realist, while his opponents, the third revolutionists, were madmen and lunatic utopians. Bukharin felt that his sober, practical calculations stood staunchly against the voluntarists who thought that they could subject the economy to their will. In Preobrazhensky's eyes, on the other hand, the expanded tempo of production was necessary for the survival and flourishing of the agricultural sector of the economy. An arrested development of industry that relied on peasant demand would not sufficiently encourage the peasants to intensify their own production. As the 1923 scissors crisis influenced Bukharin, the 1925 goods famine defined Preobrazhensky's views. Bukharin's solution and justification for the latter, commodity imports, did not fly with Preobrazhensky, who argued that such a policy would in fact undermine the domestic industries rather than help stimulate them, stating that an inflow of foreign goods will kill 2/3 or 3/4 of Soviet industry. With this, he argued for the continued maintenance of the trade monopoly. In 1926, the dispute would reemerge, and once more, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky squared off. As Bukharin began to revise his thinking once more, Preobrazhensky expanded on his socialist accumulation thesis in the book titled The New Economics, which he also released that year. By then, Bukharin had also started to take the goods famine more seriously and started to advocate for more investment in the industrial sector. Coupled with this was a war scare, which caused Bukharin to frustratingly declare that the Soviet Union was moving far too slowly in its journey towards industrialization. The fear of war had been a great influence on the right's domestic and foreign policy. Domestically, it influenced a reconsideration on industrialization and pushed them in favor of a faster than previously advocated tempo. In 1927, Preobrazhensky and the rest of the super-industrializers would be expelled from the party. Bukharin, it seems, had consolidated the party's position, and they would be moving forward with his revised industrial program. But just as it seemed that the lunatic madman had been removed, Bukharin's erstwhile comrade in arms in the war against the super-industrializers began to speak of a right danger, a deviation that was paving the way for the restoration of capitalism, though not explicitly mentioning Bukharin or his allies by name. Behind the scenes, Stalin was undermining Bukharin, and over the course of 1928 to 1929, he sidelined, then completely removed Bukharin from leadership. Stalin, now driving the Soviet boat, began to speak of rapid industrialization and collectivization. Within Stalin, Bukharin saw the specter of Preobrazhensky. He saw the ghost of Trotskyism, which he believed that he had vanquished. Bukharin even went as far as to call Stalin a neo-Trotskyite. In Bukharin's eyes, Stalin was enacting Preobrazhensky's Genghis Khan plan, which industrialized the Soviet Union via what Bukharin described as the military feudal exploitation of the peasantry. What a shock it must have been to Bukharin when he traded one set of lunatic industrializers for another, whose lunacy, it seemed to him, was 10 times worse than what he previously struggled against. The only difference then was that this time the lunatics won, and now their program he could only criticize in Aesopian language rather than openly and through official party organs.